Good morning and welcome to the Board of Education, Port Washington's Budget and Facilities meeting. I'm your host and the chair, Dave Kerpen, and I'm looking forward to chatting about budget and facilities. Obviously, we have an enormous task ahead of us in putting together a budget for next year that is responsible and to the greatest extent possible does our number one job of educating our students. At the same time, obviously, we have just more uncertainty in planning this budget than we've ever had before as a district, as a town, as a nation, as a world. And so that poses a myriad of challenges. I realize that we have not enabled chat on this meeting. I encourage anyone and everyone that's watching to participate to the greatest extent possible. You can email me as the chair, dkerpen@portnet.org. You can email the whole board, boe@portnet.org. We have been and will continue to respond to each and every email that we get. And I thank everyone for their input. We also got some feedback from our Board of Education meeting last night that there was some complicated language, some harder to understand language, and we want to make the budget process as accessible as possible to you all. Now, we got this feedback just a few minutes before this meeting, so we may not be prepared to fully dive into the more simple language and presentations that members of the community asked for today, but I assure you we will prepare it in the weeks to come. Finally, before we get started with the meeting, I want to say that I recognize that for all of us, the anxiety and the staying at home for as long as we all have has affected us in different ways and has gotten to us in different ways. And I ask members of the committee and administration in this meeting to think twice before you speak. I certainly will do the same. And I think the more that we can rely on civility and respect, the better we will do, even when we disagree. So I thank you all in advance. Committee members, board members, and members of the administration, I would ask that you post in the chat here when you want to speak so that I can keep track and assign as we normally always do. The agenda for the meeting right now, we can add things if necessary. The agenda is as asked for by the members of the committee. We had asked for an update on the roof, if any. I want to talk about busing and an idea for a ballot initiative. And of course, the most important item on the agenda is discussing the budget and budget planning for next year. Before we get started with that agenda, members of the committee, are there any other agenda items you want to add? Sure, I will say who's present. So I'm reading down on my Google Meet. We've got Christopher Shields of the administration, Deb Brooks from the board, Elaine Fennick from the administration, Beth Weisberg, our vice president, Emily Bays from the board, Jim Restano from the administration and facilities, Mary Callahan, our assistant superintendent for business, Michael Hines, our superintendent, Nora Johnson, our president, Rachel Gilliar, our board member and video engineer, who I'm guessing is John Johnert or Chris Johnert. So thanks for asking that. That's who is present. Not seeing any other agenda item requests. Let's jump in. Mary or Jim, is there any update on the roof situation?
Mary, you want to answer that, or you want me to answer it?
Why don't you provide any detail that you have, Jim? I know you and I have spoken regarding this as well.
Yeah, the roofs are still the same. obviously. I did get some further information on roof sections with a contract, but it avoids using an architect, which is extremely troublesome to me. It would be a decision, ultimate decision of the board, but it's hard for me to go that route. It's just not something you normally do, especially in my position. I'm not saying the contractor is a bad contract. I happen to know the contractor. He's done work for us in other districts. He's a very good contractor that does hold the contract for this type of work. But again, just not having the architect involved is troublesome. That's where we are right now since the last meeting. If anybody wants to ask a question regarding that, please do. I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, anyone has a question for Jim, please post in the chat and I will certainly call on you, and beginning with Deb.
Jim, can you please tell us exactly which roofs you're talking about? Is this a different section that has now come under question? Is this something
No,
you were
no.
discussing last meeting?
Still talking about Salem, Sousa, and the high school. Those are the three section pieces, those that that we're always talking about. It's the white type of roofing, the Kelly type of roofing that we're talking about. Those are the three that I'm focusing on at this point.
Thanks, Jim. Emily's asked a question via chat, and I'll simply repeat the questions via chat unless y'all say you wanna ask the question. Emily's question, Jim, is: are the roof projects in our current proposed budget? I guess that's more for Mary. And what are the specific costs that are included here?
Mary, can you help me with that one? I believe we're looking at the Salem roof, correct? For this year?
Yes, we're looking at the Salem roof, and the cost for a section at the high school is almost similar to a cost of a section at Sousa. And so I think that the selection of one or the other can be determined at a later time, but we do have the money in to do that one section at Salem, the reduced section, and the money at Salem. It also included the money for continued asbestos abatement and resurfacing the track and doing the cafeteria upgrade that is being covered in great part by the cafeteria fund. Without the cafeteria fund, we would not be able to do that job. If we do not do any money from the general fund, then we have to return that overage from the cafeteria to, not return, but give to the state the money we have in our cafeteria fund, which is a profit beyond 3 months worth of operating expense. So the total that's in that code is $1,710,100.
Thank you, Mary. Emily has a question, but first I wanted to ask you, how much is currently in for asbestos abatement?
$110,000. We had established that last year in discussion.
Thank you, Mary. I'm for the record, and we can talk about this when we talk about the budget, of course. But I will be suggesting we remove that. Emily's question.
My question actually was in line with yours, Dave. So I'm also curious, how much was the track resurface? What is the track resurfacing money? And Mary, I think maybe just for the purpose of maybe people tuning in who have not understood what the cafeteria upgrade and the cafeteria money to the state means, I think if you could just explain that a little bit further, that would be helpful. But in line with what Dave asked about abatement, which I also had a question, how much do we have for track resurface before you discuss cafeteria upgrade and what that is also?
The recoating of the track surface is $156,000, which Jim Restano has indicated to me is at least a year already beyond when it should have been done. The cafeteria serving line equipment is $610,000, and the expected cost is $1.2 million. And we run a cafeteria program with an outside vendor that is a profitable program, different from many other school districts. We are allowed to keep that revenue. It does not commingle at all with the general fund. It has nothing to do with the taxpayers. We do not ask the taxpayers to subsidize that program in any way. The monies, therefore, as a profit cannot come to the general fund. It can only be used to improve the cafeteria area itself, not even the dining area. It must be used for the kitchen area, for its equipment and any upgrades. And we have been holding that money for the last 2 years in anticipation of the capital project work that is supposed to be done at the front of the high school, the facade, the extension of the high school cafeteria, and we were going to and we have incorporated into the design the improvement of the area for preparation of food. This has been in the works for several years now.
Thank you, Mary.
Dave, can I just follow up?
Well,
I'm sorry.
Deb had posted in the chat. A quick follow-up, sure.
No, it's just a follow-up with this. So I'm just asking, with regards to these cafeteria plans, are we making adjustments with regards to the new social distancing projected requirements that we will need going forward? Specifically with the upgrade also within the kitchen area, have we, should we not be looking, oh, that was Deb's question, sorry, Deb. Should we be looking at putting those kind of things in play? I guess maybe that's a Jim question, I don't know.
Well, really, I think it's a human question with social distancing. And so the creation of the brick and mortar isn't going to change so much. It's going to be the number of people allowed within that space. So that will have to do with the seating arrangements and furniture, which is part of the general fund and has to be purchased. But as far as the design is already at the State Education Department. We're waiting approval in order to bid that project out. So if this were to be removed, it would be a big change. We would be paying a lot of money for architectural services and design review and so on. But whatever is the decision of the board.
Thank you, Mary. We've digressed a bit. Any other questions on the roof for Mary or Jim? Okay, second item on the agenda. As I mentioned last night in our public board meeting, I believe that it is there are two main levers that we can pull with respect to our budget. One is staffing, which is obviously riddled with challenges, and the other is transportation, which I'm not saying which is also riddled with challenges, because I believe that that we can potentially save significant dollars here, and because I believe that in polling parents, there are, at least informally, there are many parents who would rather drive their kids to school if we open in September than put them on a school bus. And there are obviously a myriad of challenges with respect to the social distancing on a school bus that we consider putting together a ballot initiative to change the busing lines, which would in turn save us quite a bit of money in transportation costs. So I want to discuss that, of course, as a committee, and I know, and as a board, and I know that there are some serious challenges with respect to doing this as quickly as we would have to do it. I totally understand that, and I want to hear those challenges if though, you know, because those are real. I also know that this may not be universally popular with the committee, with the board, or even with the town. But in my capacity as budget chair and board member, I think that it is our duty and my duty to bring to the table something that I think can save the district and the taxpayers quite a bit of money, and help us spend that money on our kids' education. I haven't had, Larry's asked what specific limits I'm suggesting. I haven't had the time to research. I want to make sure that that it's feasible first. But in my vision, we would change the mileage limits such that fewer people were entitled to a bus ride. And we would certainly have to figure out a way to solve for any financial hardship related issues that the new lines created. Okay, so now I'm going to open this up to discussion. It sounds like Mary is asking whether the board rep from the diversity committee has an opinion. I'll let them share if they would like to. Larry had asked what limits they're suggesting. Nora's asked, can Mary give the general parameters on the busing requirements? Mary?
Certainly. Right now, the state requirements are 2 miles for kindergarten through 8th grade, and then 9th through 12th is 3 miles. Since this idea only came to light yesterday, we were only able to run some samples based on that. And I know Sousa, for example, is, Dr. Mioli mentioned the other day, is a school that is vastly bused. Out of those 560 children, if we did go to the state limit, only about 63 or 65 children would get transportation. The other 500 would depend on families for that. Overall, for the 9th through 12th grade, if we go to the 3 mile limit, it's only the northernmost part of town that would be entitled to any transportation. And as I said, that's really only about 13% of the high school students. We would have to run a variety of different models to give you different options. It can't be done that quickly. Give me some distance limits and we will work on it, but it will take us some time. This is also not something that the board can enact itself. This, as I think the board members know, this is a resolution that would have to be put on the ballot. So that is also holding up our mailing out of any ballots, because we need to know if that has to be added to the ballot. And then the community has to approve taking away their transportation in order to save money on the levy. And as you probably all know, the community, the vast majority of the community do not have children in school.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mary. Um, Deborah's asked me to place it in context, but I'm not quite sure what you mean, Deb. Would you like to add some flavor context that you're asking about?
It's mostly for the people who are new to this process to understand that in pre-COVID times, we had our bus routes and our various costs associated with whatever it took to run a school. And we relied on state aid and we relied on the taxpayers and other forms of revenue to fund adequate programming for our children. And because of this disease and the hit that the state has taken on the various expenses, not only education, but hospitals and loss of revenue and state tax and all that other stuff, we are facing the very real possibility, although we don't know yet for sure, but the very real possibility that the state aid upon which we have come to rely and which the district has, for which the district has fought so hard to get increased over the years because of our changing demographics, may not come to our district or any district such as ours in the next year, maybe 2 years, who knows, until New York State gets back on its feet. And so this committee and the Board of Ed and Dr. Hines and Ms. Callahan have all been working since, I guess, the summer to come up with the budget for the coming year. And that all went completely kablooey when this pandemic hit because now the money has changed. And so I'm just hoping that people who are new to this understand that we're having this conversation because we don't know what money we will get from the state. And so we have to plan contingencies, which is why we have various budget options, option number 1, option number 2, option number 3. So under normal circumstances, we would not be talking about doing different bus routes because we would be able to rely on transportation aid and state aid. And I'm simply saying that hopefully this helps understand people why we're having this conversation now, because now is when we're starting to get ever-changing information from the state about the money that will or will not be coming, and we still don't know. Normally in this part of the process, we would know what our state aid is. So for the newcomers here, this is what the board, the district administration have all been struggling with, trying to be, Karnak the Magnificent, figuring out what is the right thing to do. And so we're trying to not leave any stone unturned. We're looking at the transportation.
Well, thank you, Deb. I think, well, clarity always helps everyone understand the fact that this is clearly a dramatic response to a very, very dramatic issue.
But
Next up,
I had a question. So,
well,
Mary,
I have a list. I have a list. Deb.
oh, sorry. Okay.
Okay, so next up is Nora, with respect to in your capacity as diversity committee co-chair. And please unmute yourself before you talk. Okay, I'm going to take the chair prerogative to skip Nora. We'll come back to her. And next up was Emily.
Thank you. So Mary, my question was with regards to transportation. What are our current limits? And I believe that, I think our current limits are not the state limits, correct? I think we have different limits. And I think when you were giving us some of the preliminary numbers that you gave us, it was to the actual state limits. So I'll let you answer that, Dave. I'm not done with my question, so let Mary answer.
Okay, the first part of your question response is our current limit for kindergarten through grade 5 is 1/2 mile. Excuse me. Grade 6 through 8, 3/4 of a mile, and 9 through 12 is 1.25 miles. And the state limit from kindergarten through 8th grade is 2 miles. 9 through 12 is 3 miles. So it would be a difference, a big difference.
So the numbers that you gave us as an example of before were numbers that had the state limit, right?
Yes,
That SUSA number that you said was the 2 mile versus anywhere between a half a mile to 3/4 of a mile, correct?
Yeah.
So as a board, we could come back to some sort of decision and say, so we would like to increase all the limits a 1/4 of a mile. For instance, instead of K-5 being a half a mile, we'd like to see it 3/4 of a mile and so forth going down the line. And then we could come back with runs like that,
yeah,
correct?
That's right. It would be a ballot initiative, of course, but yes.
Correct. Okay, and then we would have to bring it to ballot. Okay, so I guess those are the questions that I had with regards to that, so that we can come up with some sort of numbers and present it. My concern, and I know you asked Nora to speak with regards to diversity, and so
I am here now.
I am not going to just speak as a diversity committee representative, but I am going to speak as someone who is concerned about diversity. My concern is that whatever we decided and we would put out to ballot would not be affecting the working parent population and the population that doesn't have just access to an automobile, that does rely on our transportation for our students. So I would be very hesitant to go to the limits, because then I think the limits really does take everybody out of play. I would be curious to see maybe going up a 1/4 of a mile, if that changed anything. Would it bring down our, how would it affect our students? And I would be very interested in looking to see what I think was originally discussed a long time ago, when I think Beth brought up this whole idea of maybe giving bus passes to students that could use them from like the nice bus as opposed to our transportation, and would that save us money? So, and the other question is, can we put on the ballot eliminating high school busing, let's say, or does it have to be across the board? Do we have to legally provide busing for every student?
you
That was the
must
question.
legally provide transportation at the maximum limit. So yes, grades 9 through 12, if there's anyone left who's eligible after you
Come on.
get to 3 miles, yes.
Okay,
Right.
thank you.
That 3-mile limit, Emily, for the high school would effectively seriously decrease the amount of busing available at the high school level. I'm gonna call on Nora. I wanna say before I do that, as I mentioned earlier, I share Emily's concern about serving our neediest population here. It is, however, my belief that that were we to change the limits in working with this amazing community and some of the amazing organizations in this community, we could put our heads together and figure out a way to serve our neediest populations, to get them safely and consistently to school. That being said, Nora, of course, love to hear from you on this.
Emily generally covered what I was going to say on behalf of the diversity committee and those who are more needy than others in this community. Many people do not have access to a vehicle, and if they do, that's the vehicle that they'll hopefully be using to get themselves back to work. So we have many kids, that will not have access to a car, and they do fall upon this falls upon not just the immigrant community, but on behalf of the diversity committee, I could say that it falls upon many of the new immigrants to this country. I also wanted to say that as we discussed this from the beginning, I never envisioned it, and we have been discussing this for a little while, I didn't envision it going to the max, to the 3-mile limit or to the 2-mile limit. I did consider it to be some sort of a hybrid that we would work out, as we just said, like adding another 1/4 of a mile or adding another half a mile of distance that students would either walk to school or find some other method of transportation, including that idea of a bus pass, which would be, one of the ways to go. But the other thing that I want to say, and this isn't for the, on behalf of the diversity committee, this is just in general. Given the amount of work that we have to do on this budget in the next 2 weeks, and the fact that this is a separate ballot item, I think we should consider the fact that we can do this vote and this initiative anytime. Like, our budgetary problems, unfortunately, are not going to be just for 2021 at the rate things are going. We're going to have to look at doing things differently going forward. Now, I hope, the economic forecast gets better, but we're still going to have to be looking at unique, creative ways to save money. And we could do this bus initiative, work on it over the summer and present it in the fall. I don't know realistically how we're going to add this to the members, to the administrators' plates, and to the community's plates, even to digest what this means between now and when they have to actually get their ballots in by June 9th. Because it is a change, and we've had so many changes already, but this is a change that really has to be digested by a lot of people. After it's worked out, the logistics are worked out by us. So I'm saying that I think it's probably not something that's realistically going to be done in the next 2 weeks, which is what we're talking about.
Thank you, Nora. As you know, I respectfully disagree with respect to our ability to potentially get this together quickly and the urgency with which we could save a really significant amount of money if we could get it together quickly. Next up is Beth.
Thanks, Dave. Yes, as Emily said, this was my idea that I had, I think, brought up, I don't know, in March. I think it's a valid idea. I think I agree with Nora and I agree with Emily. I never also envisioned this going to the maximum miles. I envisioned it going to a mileage that is reasonable to walk for the K-8 level, which I think for most of us when we were kids, many of us probably walked. In fact, in this very town, I walked a mile to school at the age of 5. So it's certainly a reasonable distance for a child to walk. I say that because many people have don't have cars at home or have childcare people who don't drive, and so I think from that K-8 range it should be drivable. I think, that being said, I think for the older kids, I think there are some decent transportation options in town. I did a little bit of research, and from what I can tell, a student bus pass, which is something we actually should look into doing for some of our students, because a student bus pass to and from school on the NICE bus doesn't seem to cost anything. All we need to do is send a photo ID of our students to NICE, and they get a student bus pass that is usable for transportation to and from the school from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m., which is something I think, even if we opt not to do this, is something we should be cognizant of, because there are students that perhaps live in places where they might miss the late bus at the high school and would appreciate being able to get back home to areas that are serviced by that bus. So it's something we should look into anyway. But I think, I certainly would think, maybe a 2-mile limit for high school and a mile limit for elementary school is something we can look at. I do think it's doable for this year. And I do think it's something, we should just, listen, I think this is the 3rd year I've actually brought this up at a budget committee meeting as something I'd like to discuss. So I think this is something was reasonable with or without the crisis. I think the crisis just steps up the timeline and makes it perhaps more important that we look into things.
Thank you, Beth. Deb is up next.
Thanks. My questions were asked and answered.
Fantastic. Next up, then, Nora. I think we got you when we covered you recently, so I'm going to go ahead to Larry.
Okay, a couple of things. I think before we make any major changes to our bus routes, we have to discuss this with the police, because as we make changes to the bus routes, there are going to be more kids having to cross Port Boulevard. There are going to be significantly more cars driving onto Campus Drive and to all the elementary schools in the morning. So there were going to be some traffic and some safety issues involved. I have a couple of issues if we try to save this money in this budget and the resolution goes down, then we're sort of stuck. If we fund the full busing and the resolution passes, we have a little bit of a cushion. So I would suggest we do not anticipate any of these savings. I'm not, philosophically, I'm opposed to paying as much money as we do for transportation, but we also do have to get the kids to school. This might be a question that Mary can answer, and we might need to throw this up to Howard, but there are a lot of requirements for school buses, such as seatbelts. Those same requirements probably do not exist on the NICE bus. Are we legally allowed to put children on our dime, essentially, into something that doesn't meet the safety standards of the state education department? Now, I know they do it in New York City, but New York City has a lot of different regulations than the rest of the state. So I'd be curious as to whether or not it's something we're allowed to do. But in theory, it's a nice plan if you happen to live where the NICE bus goes, which isn't really a wonderful route for a lot of people also. We'd also have to look and see whether the NICE buses are appropriate enough for all of our children and can get people up from wherever they are, again, without having to cross Port Boulevard with no crossing guards, without, a lot of the stuff that happens when you have more kids out on the street during rush hour in the morning.
Thank you, Larry. A couple of really good points, and I'm seeing Emily agree, and I certainly agree with you that we, if we did move forward with this, would have to account in the budget for the ballot initiative potentially failing, which could give us, of course, a very, very much needed cushion if, in fact, it passed. Not seeing any more questions, I'm going to suggest and put open for the rest of the committee and board's consideration that clearly under normal circumstances, we would take more time on this. These are far from normal circumstances, which is why I want to do the best possible job to expedite this, if at all possible. So I would like to authorize or ask Mary to look into the ramifications, both financial and sort of community impact wise, on a couple of different models with respect to increasing the limits. And if we could get some quick consensus on what those couple different options looked like, that would be terrific. I would strongly urge us to go to the max for high school, the 3 mile for high school. And I would suggest that for K through 8, we look at what it would look like if we were to increase to, say, 3/4 of a mile and then 1 mile. Sort of Beth brought up the when I was a kid thing, and don't get me started with how far I commuted on my own as a kid. I think those are relatively reasonable, and I would love to get some consensus if those numbers are agreeable to at least look into for next time. So if you want to weigh in on that, it looks like we've got Emily, then Deb.
So I think we already got Dave, the mileage or the numbers that it would be for the high school max. And I think I remember Mary sending out that it would be 63 students would be eligible. And I have a strong objection to that. That means nobody is taking the bus. And not that I think kids are actually taking the bus, because I have seen many empty school buses from the high school, but that does not mean that we can't give access. We need to give access to these students. And so I have a problem with the 3 limit. What I would like to see is 2 different models. And the first model being what I suggested earlier, going up 1/4 of a mile. So in other words, K through 5, instead of a 1/2 a mile, make it 3/4 of a mile. 6 through 8, make it 1 mile. 9 through 12, make it 1.5 miles. So increase it slightly and let us see if that is an option. And then I think the second option may be bring it all up a half a mile. So in other words, make K through 5 a 1 mile distance, 3 to 6 to 8, make it 1.25. I mean, whatever, you all know I can't do the math, but, and maybe do take the high school to the 2 mile limit as Beth suggested to try to make it up it a little bit more. But I think we should do gradual and see if that changes and maybe a little bit more, but to go to the max, specifically with the high school, 63 kids, and as Nora pointed out, those would be the Sands Point kids, and those kids are definitely not taking the bus. So, that would be eliminating effectively our high school buses.
Thank you, Emily. I think the point that you made regarding the empty school buses is why I feel strongly about the high school. I just don't think I just think we're spending a lot of money on empty buses when it comes to the high school, and that's why I had recommended the maximum. But I certainly hear you, and let's hear the rest of the board weigh in on this. We've got next up, I believe, Deb. Just hold on one second, because that spurred a lot of comments. Yes, Deb, and then you guys are posting but not saying you want to talk. So Deb, and then Larry. And then
So in my brain, these mileage limits are supposed to magically correspond to the population density, but they don't. So if we go half a mile in or a mile in one direction in Port Washington, we have density. If we go in the other direction, we don't. And so I guess my question would be, where does it make the most sense economically? Where do we save the most money without hurting the most amount of kids? In other words, if we were to go 2 miles north, then we're into Sands Point pretty much without a lot of density. But if we go 2 miles south, we're very dense. So does it make sense to do it by mileage, or does it make sense to do it by the population distributions, if I'm making any sense? I know we can't go beyond the state limits, but
I don't believe we can legally redraw the lines with in one direction one way and not the other way. Mary, can you
I
confirm?
know mileage is the law, Beth. I understand that the mileage is the law, but what I'm saying is, saying to go a quarter mile may be arbitrary if a quarter mile one way doesn't help at all, but a quarter mile in the other way does help. That's what I'm trying to say.
That's why we're going to look at different. That's why we're going to look at different different outcomes.
I wasn't talking about gerrymandering. I was saying let's look at which what's, rather than arbitrarily say which mileage, let's look at what saves us the most money and makes the most sense and work from that. And if it happens to be a quarter mile, a half of a mile, depending on the radius, that's what I'm saying.
And Deb, I think that's what I'm trying to do here, and by looking at the impact given certain parameters. Okay, next up was, please post in the chat, Nora, because I see all the chats that are ahead of you. Okay, next up is
Beth.
Beth.
Larry.
Larry, then Beth.
Okay. Again, the kids aren't fungible, and denying busing to 100 kids in one area might be fine because they have the safety and ability to walk to school. Knocking out another 100 kids may mean that 20 of them don't show up for school. So I think we have to be very careful about which populations are affected by each parameter that we go through. And we had that safe streets thing on the agenda last night, and there's a lot of places where it is not safe for children to cross the street. And if we create more of those areas, we're risking the lives of our children. And I would much rather be pushing for changes in regulations that don't make us run empty buses, that we can more easily target the number of people rather than having to provide buses for all the children. I know we've worked on that in the past and we've gotten somewhere on it, But, I'd like to see more flexibility. I'd like to see us be able to run more small buses rather than large buses, and save some money that way and save the environment somewhat. But also, people to get to the high school, people are going to have to start getting here at 6:30 to make that left turn into Campus Drive because there's going to be so many people coming in. And that is a very real concern. All of these volunteers who are picking these kids up and driving are going to get stuck in the same traffic while commuters are trying to get to the train station. So, there's a lot of unintended consequences that we may see as a result of this. And I think we need to be really careful before we just sort of run into it looking at it just from an economics cost.
Yep, I hear you, Larry, and I agree. This is very, very hard. This is not an easy decision, but that's ultimately our job, is to come up with the creative solutions to protect the education of our kids, as you know. Beth, you're up next.
Thanks, Dave. So Deborah, I think to your point, that's what Emily was asking for when she said she wanted to look at things in quarter-mile increments. I don't think she was talking about just looking to see what was saving money. I think she was talking about looking to see who the kids were that we were affecting. I think that's my point. I just have a question for Mary. If we do this via proposition, are we bound? In other words, I know we can't bus beyond the limits, but are we allowed at that point, let's say we made it a 3-mile limit for high school, are we allowed to decide as a board that we're going to provide transportation at the 2-mile limit? In other words, can we go under that limit as a board once that proposition is passed, or are we bound by exactly the limits that are decided at that proposition? I don't know if that question makes sense, but that's my question.
No, it does.
Great question. Beth.
Yes, and you are bound by it until you pass another proposition. I did also, excuse me, ask the transportation director to provide me with some of the route information, which I can forward to you, or I can give you some samples of different bus routes that have 45 children on it, 37 children, 27, 34, 44. We also have the pre-K busing to consider. Schreiber, here's another one, 39. The buses, I'll send you this information. It's too much to read, and it's all in pencil format anyhow, because these are informal surveys that happen over a 2-week period twice a year. But you will see that the buses have plenty of children on them in the morning and at 3 o'clock. So,
Thank you, Mary. Next up is Nora, and then Rachel.
It's probably been covered already, but I think that we need to look at a lot of things, but and as Larry pointed out, it's not just about saving money. It's about considering that kids are still going to be able to get to school, and that we don't, the most disadvantaged kids aren't the kids that can't get to school. But I think we need to see what would be saved, as Emily said, and as I was thinking, if we increased by 0.25, and then if we increased by, two runs. One's say increasing by 1/4 mile, one's increasing by 1/2 mile, and maybe going for the high school up to say 1.75 and then 2 miles. I don't think we should go to 3 miles. I think that's a really long way to go, although perhaps the kids who live 3 miles away will be driving. But I think we have to see right from the beginning what kind of money we're talking about saving before we go ahead and spend a lot of time, because it is a very complicated issue that includes getting kids, saving money, of course, which I'm all in favor of, but it also includes getting all the kids to school, and all the safety issues, which are big. But I want to see the money savings before we proceed, because we don't have a lot of time, and we want to see what are we talking about here.
Thank you, Nora. Rachel, and then we're going to wrap up this discussion, because obviously we still have a lot to talk about with respect to the budget.
Well, first of all, to anybody who's watching me fidget and move around and get up and down, I just want to make clear that parents of Port Washington, I know exactly what you're going through because I'm living it too. And I'm listening to this budget call and I'm supervising a kid's meetup next to me. And I know we're all juggling and it's hard. The other thing is, I think I wanted to start by saying, Dave, I really applaud you for bringing this up, even though it is controversial. And one second, I'm talking. And I personally believe that I agree with everybody who's saying we have to do a lot of due diligence, and agree with what Larry said about the fact that there will be a lot of unintended consequences. So I'm worried about the time frame of being able to do that in time to put it on as a ballot initiative. I put in the chat, I'm fairly confident that we could just word the initiative in a way that allows us the freedom to provide more busing later on if we choose to do that. Most legal problems can be solved with good wording. So I think we could solve that, but I'm worried about the 2 weeks being too fast. But I think it's really important that we're having this conversation, and I'm really glad that you brought it to the table, Dave, because I think it's good for us to have these creative ideas to come up with a little bit more capital or save a little bit more money, even if they're controversial, and talk them through and do the work and see if they make sense, because this is how we're going to come up with some different ways to solve this problem without impacting the education here, which I think is number one for all of us.
That's right. Thank you, Rachel. So as mentioned, I'm going to wrap up this discussion and move on to the budget. It sounds like the good news is that whether we all agree on the limits or not, we've already done the max, looked at what the max would look like. So I am going to ask you, Mary, per Emily's suggestion and Nora's suggestion, and it seems like the consensus of the board, to look into both the financial impact and the impact on the community of increasing the elementary and the middle school ranges by both a quarter of a mile and a half a mile, and increasing the high school by both a half and 3/4 of a mile. I would urge the board to think about the high school max. We already have what that looks like financially, and we'll leave that to our next discussion. But Mary, if you can follow up with those things, that would be great. And seeing a verbal nod, I will take that as
Certainly. Yes.
thank you so much. Okay, now on to the really fun stuff, the budget for 2020-21. As everyone here knows, Mary presented a few options last night, and want to continue the discussion. As I mentioned at the beginning of the call, obviously we have tons of challenges with respect to uncertainty here. One of the things that is uncertain is teacher retirements, as we know. And another thing that is uncertain is a state aid. And we hope to have a better idea of both as soon as possible. But until we do, we need to nonetheless proceed. If y'all have comments on the various options, please post in the chat, or if you have questions about the various options, please post in the chat, and I will lead the discussion. By the way, normally we go 90 minutes. I'm just going to take a quick look at my own hard stop. It is, in fact, at 11:30, so I'm going to end this meeting at 11:30, but let's talk as much as we can about the budget in the next half hour. Looks like, Larry, you are up first.
Okay. I totally understand the economic pain that a lot of the community is feeling. I have clients who haven't worked in 8 weeks. I have, lots of this. I see it. But what we're talking about with these different scenarios is playing around the edges about whether something's going up 1% or 2% or staying flat or going down 1%. If Mary could come up with a 50% reduction to the budget with no change in quality, I would be there right away. But I think we have to be really careful with any scenario that gives us layoffs, because while it gives us a marginal short-term savings, it gives us a decade or a generation of kids that are going to be getting less of a quality education, which means they will have more trouble getting into college. They will get lower paying jobs. They will pay less taxes over their life. It will lower our home values because our neighboring communities, which have more reserves, will probably not be doing layoffs. So we will fall in relationship to our neighbors in terms of the quality education that we're giving our kids. The things we would have to be cutting, we're not going to be cutting English or math. We're going to be cutting the things that aren't mandated. We're going to be cutting the things that make kids want to come to school. We're going to be cutting the PEP. We're going to be cutting a lot of the non-mandated special ed services. We're going to be cutting a lot of the things around the edges that will hurt our most vulnerable kids. And I think it will also end up sending more kids to private schools, which will increase our busing costs because we're required to drive them there. So that there's a lot going into it. So I certainly understand the optics of trying to be as good as possible, and I understand the optics of wanting to pass this budget. But if we're talking about a $200 or $300 savings versus a generation of kids, I think we have to be really, really careful about doing that.
Thank you very much, Larry. We have a list coming in the chat. Thank you so much, guys. I'm going to speak briefly first on a couple items that I see as more easily cuttable in order to protect those all important jobs that you mentioned, Larry. One I mentioned earlier, the $110K in asbestos removal. I believe thinking about priorities that can wait, and I would put that to the committee and board for your consideration. Also, you will chuckle, and no one I don't think will be surprised when you hear me suggest that the $130K for the print and copy center, I believe, is an expense that can be cut, and that we can, of course, cut the amount of work that we do, and see a very nice savings there as well. Okay, next up, I believe, is Beth. Yes, so Beth, then Emily. Beth, then Emily.
So Dave, listen, and Larry, I completely agree and hear you. You're going to all hear me say this over and over again, and it's not an empty threat. I don't think there's much of I think we have to be so careful, because the voting methodology, for those of you who missed it, I know it was a question on the list, there will be no in-person voting. A ballot will come to each family, each house, each registered voter with a self-addressed stamped envelope to be returned. That's the voting for this particular election. So because of that, I think that there may be a high probability more voters than we typically have, and so we have to make sure that we're careful. That said, I think looking at the proposals in abstract, the way we are looking at them now, doesn't answer some of the questions that people are bringing up, i.e., if we make those cuts, what does that look like? And so I personally would like to see, when you say cut 10 teachers, what do you envision? Because I'm not talking, obviously it's not 10 teachers, it's 10 positions, or 10 whatever you want to call it. And so I think we need to look at what the administration envisions those 10 would be, because I think talking about it in the abstract is not helping us or helping the community envision what those cuts look like. So that's my request, is that the next time we sit down and do this, we are saying, 3 high school positions at, one social studies, 1 math, 1 English, which will have X effect. I don't think we can talk about this in abstract anymore. I think we need to know the reality.
Thank you, Beth. For next time, Mike and Mary, if you can, per Beth's request, please outline what your vision would be for which positions would be accessed if necessary. Next up is Emily.
Thank you. I actually, part of my question was what Beth pointed out. I think we do need to hear more definitive type of presentations and of what it would look like. But I also want us to discuss, and I don't want us to forget, and I know we brought it up last night and I'm saying it again, and I think that that is also something that should be helpful going forward, is what our budget proposals looked like, and I'm going to say pre-COVID, and what they now look like post-COVID. So if we remember back to February, we were discussing adding positions, we were discussing doing a lot of very different things. And since then, we've gone back and made some changes. So, you know, we are in a position where we as a board have told and the administration together have said, well, things aren't the same as they used to be. And although we are below the tax levy limit, we are still, you know, trying to figure out ways to save. And the reason I think we're trying to save is because I do share Beth's sentiment, and Larry has said it as well. I don't know that the state aid that we've received now, these runs that we're going by, are going to hold up in the next couple of weeks. And we are being told that, you know, why are we jumping the gun, and why are we, you know, panicking? But I think we're trying to be a little bit more proactive than reactive. So I would like to say that based on all these proposals that we have seen, I think we as a board, and I think Mary has asked in the past, have to decide what's the number we want to be at, because we keep saying, and I don't know that we even have the answer to that, but I would be comfortable in saying, so option A that we saw last night had us at a 2.73 levy, and that had no cuts and had no retirements. So, you know, what are we comfortable at presenting to the community? What do we think post-COVID do we think our community can support? In my opinion, again, just my opinion, I believe that we have to come in at a 2%, and that as the levy. That to me is the number that we need to get to. I don't know what that means, and I leave that then to Mary and Mike to figure out what that means. But I believe that, again, having been parent council president in the past, having been an HSA president and been part of that process of how do we get a budget passed, I think we can make a very strong statement to the community at large that our tax levy limit is 3.96, I think, Mary, you said, if I remember correctly, and we are coming in at 2%. We are coming in below the cap because we understand you would go a lot further. And I would like to do it without cuts. So I don't know that that's possible. So I'm giving the administration a number, and which I think they have asked for. And I think we need to just give them the number and let them come back to us with what they believe that number would look like. Those are my comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily. Nora is up next.
Okay, I agree with what Emily said about levy being at 2%, and I think we have to be, and we are. I mean, the reason we're having this discussion is because we're working and trying our best to combine the maintaining the best education possible and being mindful of the economic devastation that's being caused and will continue to be caused by this COVID crisis. So I think that that 2% levy is under the circumstances realistic, and I'll say that it's way lower than what we had before, and it's way lower than anything I've ever advocated for before. And looking at the comments and questions that we did get from last night, I think what we need to do is to, and we've done this on budgets before, and before this time in the budget process, is along with figuring out the different choices, give the numbers how this would impact different households. I mean, not, you know, like given the average price of a home, what is the tax implication on that home, and then people can extrapolate from there. And I also agree when we're talking about cutting positions or, well, that's what it is, cutting positions and cutting programs. We have to get specific too, because people have to know sooner rather than later, and it's already later just due to the way this whole thing unfolded, what that actually means, because it's a very abstract concept and not something that, we were looking to build 3 months ago. Now we're looking to cut and hopefully not cut to the bone. And so much of it is out of our control. So for what we can control, we need to control, and we need to, I'd say, educate, we need to illuminate, we need to get the word out to the public, because it's not stuff that the general public has looked at before, because we haven't even looked at it before. That's what I have to say.
Thank you, Nora. I agree with the sentiment. I'm chuckling. I guess instead of sooner rather than later, it's later rather than even later than that. I'm getting some consensus. I'm hearing some consensus around following up with two major ways. One, the what positions might get cut in some of the specific positions in some of the various options, and also what are the tax implications for the community with the various options, and understanding each of those will be valuable. Yes, I know, Deb, you're next. You're next. I've got this, I promise. Deb's up next, and then I think we're going to hear from Mike.
Thank you. I think it's also important to note, well, my daughter was very young when we had the last budget fail many years ago. And living through that was actually pretty harrowing, I can say, with a young child. And I would not want to see this district go backwards, because we were climbing. I say this every single time, but I feel like I have to, especially for the newcomers. We really clawed our way back because we didn't overtax the community the way some of our other districts in the area have taxed the community, and they have the built up reserves to show for it. And we clawed our way back to a really good spot, and with the tax cap. And now the fact that we can't even add a much needed social worker that we had wanted to add at the middle school, especially now when the kids are going back after having been out of school for so long, and with some of the issues the kids are going to be facing, just shows how really fiscally prudent we're trying to be with all of this. So what I would like Mary to address is the long-term implications of removing some of these items from the budget, knowing how hard it was to claw our way back in the past 10 years with the tax cap. If we remove, if we cut staff now, what are the long-term implications? Because we can't add all 10 people back, when we're feeling flush and having a good year. We still have the tax cap. So if Mary, it doesn't have to be now, but I'm wondering if the board would like for Mary to address that for the community, so the community understands that making cuts is probably a lot easier than bringing everybody back. I mean, it's painful, but it's really, really hard to bring it back to what it was because of the law and just the tax cap. So that's what I wanted to say. And also different people will be affected differently by the tax increase. A lot of variables go into it. You can have homes of similar value, but if the footprints are different, if it's tricky. So I just caution everybody that it's a guesstimate, and it's really, I think if you wanted to know, I think last year Mary suggested that people call the county assessor's office for a better understanding. But so that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you, Deb. Some folks had asked on the board for Dr. Hines to chime in here, and Mike, I'm not asking. Personally, I'm not asking yet for the positions. I think that would take some time and thoughtfulness, and I wouldn't expect or even want you to speak to that yet. But perhaps you can speak to your general perspective on the budget options.
Definitely. Yeah, for me to remain this quiet for this long was made sure I was on mute. And all kidding aside, I really appreciate the fact how this board is truly turning over every single rock and trying to find money in every single place before we start even looking at staff. And that's incredibly important for the community to know. The second thing is, and I think Emily brought this up, we started at 3.96, but I believe, and Mary, please correct me if I'm wrong, because of the exemptions in the formula, we could have actually gone a little bit higher, but we stayed below. I'm not sure if it was closer, if it was over 4, but we were close, but we were still just a smidge under. And so now we're looking at the fact that we're having that. If we're as close to 4 as can be, and now it looks like the levy number is at 2, you're talking about a lot of work that's gone into getting it to that number. And again, the focus on not wanting to touch staff. And when we talk about staff, it's not just teachers. It's it's every staff member that works in the capacity of serving kids, whether it's administrator, whether it's a paraprofessional, clerical, custodial. So there's a whole bunch of things that go into this decision making if and when we get there. And I think Dave brought this up before, or I think we all have in some capacity, is we still don't know the state aid perspective. So yes, we will come up with something clearly for the board to consider if and when we had to touch staff. But then we need to really think about 2 other things. What if there's more state aid decrease? Do you go into the well of reserves and offset that? And if not, then where would that other amount come from? And then I think we really have to, and again, only Dave and clearly if the rest of the board wants to do this, when we talk about contingency, what does that look like? We're talking about several $1 million then. On top of that, that would have to be cut. And is that something that we want to, figure out and discuss as far as what that impact will be? So, and again, I want to get ahead of myself because I do want to be optimistic. I want to be cautiously optimistic, but I also want to be pragmatic as well, to make sure that you have, and this community has, all the information that they need in order to make an informed decision.
Thanks, Mike. Because for time considerations as well as, mostly time considerations, I'm going to suggest that board members post in chat, and then I can use that to get the temperature of the room. I'll ask you to post in chat on both the levy limit, which is certainly all important, and then also on my proposal, much less important, but every dollar counts, regarding taking both the asbestos removal out as well as the print and copy shop. And if, of course, if we don't have consensus on those, we won't proceed with that direction to Mary. But I'm hoping we can have some consensus on one of those at least. And then to Emily's point, we do need to give Mary and direction with respect to what that number needs to look like sooner rather than later. And then it's obviously an enormous puzzle, but you still have to start with the corners, right? And you always start with the corners of the puzzle, and then you work your way from there. And I think in this case, the corners is that levy limit. So I'm going to stop talking and see if we did get some consensus on chat on anything. So I'm just going to literally read out loud for a moment here. So thank you very much in advance for bearing with me. Okay, so it looks like for the first few of us that have posted, we're at around that 1.9% on the limit. That's only 3 of us that have posted. That's me, Beth, and Emily. The reason, again, I asked you to post versus comment is for time considerations. But that being said, we still do have some time. So Rachel has asked to speak, and if you want to speak to any of these issues, Emily as well, and Nora is right in there as well. So we're well on our way to consensus. But perhaps the people that haven't posted are the ones that might not agree. So, Rachel?
So just because I know a lot more people are probably paying attention to this budget process at this point, or hopefully, than were before, Mary, can you just remind everybody what the levy limit is?
She said that already.
Well,
Not the number, what it means.
no.
Oh.
What, like, no, I meant like the actual number. It's
Oh,
3
sorry.
something, right, this year?
Well, the levy limit will adjust depending on what your overall budget is and how much you put in the transfer to capital line. As Dr. Hines said earlier, we are over 4% according to the levy limit that we legally can tax the community.
Right.
But I have been ignoring the limit in all of these calculations because my directive has been to provide something that is lower than the limit and based on the revenues that the district anticipates receiving along with the state aid, that then and $1 million from your fund balance is how I have been coming up with the actual levies. So either we add more money on the revenue side to lower the levy, or we do lower the budget to bring the levy down further.
So just, I mean, I know this is enormously complicated for people. I just want to make clear again, we were really more towards that 4% number before. 2% is a lot lower, and we were adding positions here. So
Yeah.
My concern is both the concern that Deborah and Larry have raised, that it's going to take years and years to recover from this, and because we do have a levy limit in New York, we can't just decide, well, it's been a good year, we'll recoup these positions now. We have to do it piece by piece by piece, which is what we were still continuing to do from the last time. In fact, this year's budget, as it was originally drafted by you, had some of the positions that we were finally completing the build back on from the last time that we had serious financial problems. So my concern is that we're talking about not this year, we're talking about the next decade or two for children in Port Washington, which is a lifetime. It's their schooling. It's their entire elementary experience or their entire high school and middle school experience. It's going to affect the quality of the education. My other concern that ties into that is if we cut sports, if we cut clubs, if we cut art and music and PEP, the children that will be hit the hardest by that are the children whose families cannot afford to simply just provide those things at home. And I think that that is one of the roles of public education that is so crucial. Public education is a great equalizer, and particularly when we know that families have been hit hard financially and may have less resources when this is over than they had before. I do think that we have an obligation to be leveling the playing field for children, to be giving them those opportunities that their parents can't simply buy for them. I'm opposed in general to cutting teachers because I don't think we have any extra teachers. When we cut teachers, I want to remind everybody, when we cut teachers, we impact the experience for the children. We're talking about larger class sizes. We're talking about maybe cutting some of the options for kids. The other thing is, I agree with Beth and everybody else who has said we need a little bit more particularity, I think, so people can wrap their minds around this. But as the community is thinking about this, don't think, oh, 10 teachers, it'll probably be someplace that doesn't affect me, or they'll cut ones that don't matter, they're extra, the teacher's salary are already a big part of the budget. You should assume that these cuts are going to directly impact your children. It's going to mean your child is sitting in a class with more children and getting less differentiation and less individual attention. It's going to mean that maybe your kid can't be in a club or on a sport or in PEP. We should assume that it is going to hit everybody because that's a fair way to allocate it. And I'm sure our administration isn't just going to decide that nobody's going to play baseball next year. They're going to have to do it a little bit everywhere across the board so that it's fairly distributed. So I think the particularities are good. I think that'll help people. I personally think that the levy needs to be higher than 2%. I share everybody's concern that we face an uphill battle on passing this budget, but I think people have to remember that public education is really important. The other piece that I really would love for you to add, Mary, because these numbers are hard for people to wrap their mind around. You know, when you say 0.71 is a 1 million increase in the budget, that sounds like a really big number. But from 2% to the 2.78 option, what's the average per household increase, right? So I think I've said before, you know, if I'm paying $15,000 in taxes, $100 added to my tax bill, although I'm going to be upset about it in this particular time, maybe that's not going to be the thing that makes or breaks me. So I'm with Larry. This is like, this is making small changes, and I don't see cutting it so close to the line that we impact the education here without some miraculous big change. I'm also very worried that if we get mid-year cuts, we will not have the wiggle room to deal with it if we've made the levy really low and dealt with getting up to where we need to be in terms of financing by taking out of our reserves. We need those reserves because we have literally no idea what is going to happen with our state aid. And I think it's possible. I mean, I don't want to throw any scary numbers out, but like, we literally have no idea. Are we getting any state aid next year? Are we getting half of it? You know, are we getting $10,000 from the state? We need to be ready to make up the difference if we have to. And our reserves are much, much, much lower than our neighboring districts. We have not saved for this day. And so
I've got to cut you off because we have other people.
Sorry, go ahead, Dave.
I hear you. And what we are all weighing in this hardest of decisions is putting a budget forward that could be shot down by many, many potential no voters given the mail-in ballot. And so we have to weigh one bad choice against another bad choice. This is not easy. And I have a deep love of this town. And I also have a 5-year-old that is going to go through school. I want as much as anyone for the education to remain amazing here in Port Washington. We have to weigh it. It's a very hard balance. Emily, and then Nora, and then we are wrapping up.
Okay, I just wanted to say also that I too am a big proponent of education, and it's not just, Dave, the mail-in ballot with regard to potential no voters and giving them the access with mail-in. I think it's the reality that many people in our community who were always yes voters and big supporters of education have lost their jobs or have gotten pay cuts. So we need to be conscious of our entire community, not just, you know, the few. So we have to keep that in mind. I want to go back to the process because you all know I'm a crazy person with regards to process. So we've had many discussions about numbers. I would like to propose, based on what Rachel said and Deborah has said, and what we all, and Nora and all of us, that Mary gets these numbers: 1.99, 2.5, and 2.73, which has already been presented to us, which does not have any sort of cuts in the mix. And I would like for them to take those numbers and then go back and figure out how that can be done. And that may mean cutting the print shop. That may mean eliminating the asbestos abatement. That, I think, Dave, we need to leave in their hands. I think they need to go back and say, what can we eliminate? It may mean that we eliminate 5 positions. It may eliminate none if we figure it out creatively. If we go to the directors and to the principals and say, you each need to cut $100,000, figure it out. So I would like for us to task our administration with those 3 numbers: 199, 2.5, and 2.73. Those are the numbers that I saw in the chat, and let's take it from there. That was my 2 cents.
Thank you, Emily. Nora?
Emily really covered what I was going to say, but I would just like to emphasize, in response to what Rachel said, every single one of us sitting here is a huge advocate and a huge proponent for public education. Every single one of us wanted to see the education, the district wants to see the district grow, wanted to see the 7 positions that we were going to add pre-corona, would have preferred to see 10 positions because we could have used 2 social workers at Weber. We could have, I'm not going to enumerate all the things that we can't do now. So it's not at all a question of not wanting to build on the education here. And it's not, we're all aware that once you cut, it's very hard to get back. And it's, you can't just put it back the next year. There's no magic wand. But these are extremely tough decisions, but it's a question of what's bad and what's worse. And I'm afraid if we don't propose something bad, because I don't like what we're proposing, I don't like I don't know what 1.99 is going to look like as a levy limit, as the tax levy, but I know I'm not going to like it. But I'm going to like it more than a contingency budget. And I think that's probably the same for like every parent in the district. But, we're really deciding we're making Sophie's choice here. It's a terrible time and we're trying to make the most of it and preserve as much as we can for the community and the students and the families that we love and that we're committed to.
Thank you, Nora. So per Emily's suggestion, I would like to ask you, Mary, to come up with those 3 plans, what that looks like, and working with Mike on what the specific positions might look like that get cut. We have near consensus on asbestos, but we're not quite there yet. So again, per Emily's point, we'll trust you guys to look at what those options might include. Normally, we would take community comments at this point. Obviously, we are not today, but I want to remind you and urge you, if you have comments or questions, please feel free to email me, dkerpen@portnet.org, or you can email the whole school board, boe@portnet.org. And I look forward to continuing to work out this process with you. I thank everyone who stood by and watched this 93-minute meeting. I thank members of the committee, members of the board, and members of the administration. And until next time, we are adjourned. Thanks all.